Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the 1970s, the Nixon era at home, domestic policy. Last time we looked at his foreign policy, détente, and some of the various things being done there in regard to Vietnam and especially in regard to China. Some very different and interesting things happening there. But today we are going to take a look at what was happening at home. And this is where really the title of this chapter, The Stalemated 70s, will really start to make a whole lot of sense and really where it gets a lot of that because stalemate, stagnant, not moving, not a lot of progress, things kind of seeming to stay still, and seemingly a lack of growth, a lack of progress being made, even though that may not be entirely true. That is probably a good way to describe at least the perception and the feeling, and it is true, and to a good degree, about the 1970s economy, especially because the economy was truly in a state of stagnation, of being stalemated and being kind of stuck in a particular place. So we're going to be looking a lot at that and talking about where that name comes from and some of the ways that the Nixon administration attempted to respond to some of those economic problems and their various levels of successes. So we're going to be focusing on a lot of different things here. Again, the economy is going to be a big part of it, but we're also going to talk about continuing movements towards civil rights and activism. Particularly, we're going to look at women, and we're going to begin actually with looks at environmental activism. So the activism of the 1960s most certainly does not stop when we hit 1970. That does continue on throughout the 1970s and 80s and even into the present. So we're going to be looking at those things, the environment, the role of women and women's rights, and of course the economy of the 1970s as well. But let's get started with the environment. Now, you may recall we did actually already talk about some measures in the Great Society that had to do with the environment. I suppose you could say this really goes as back as far as the earliest, conservation movements under Teddy Roosevelt, establishment of national parks and things like that. But there was very much a much more of a growing concern by the 1950s and most certainly by the 1960s, concern and worry over the damage that humans were doing to the environment, the impact that human life, the impact that industrialization, the impact of growth, whether that was, the building of interstate highways, industrial growth after the Second World War, whatever. But great concern was beginning to grow over the damage that was doing to the environment, over the long-term damage that was doing to air quality, to wildlife, to natural resources, to water, all those different kinds of things. And again, we did see some efforts in the Great Society, things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were passed. For the first time, trying to not just conserve the environment, but try to protect it and perhaps even try to reverse some of the damage that had been done by that human impact. But we start to see much more the environmental movement becoming much more unified, becoming much more cohesive, becoming much more easily identified as an activist movement in its own right, and not just sort of fringe legislation, and much more consolidated efforts by the federal government to put environmental protection as one of its goals and to enact environmental protection laws, and to just be a little bit more strategic and a little bit more involved in environmental protection. One of the big sort of game-changing moments in environmental protection that really changes sort of the mindset around it and really makes environmental protection a much more, I suppose you could say, fashionable, accepted movement that more and more people were concerned about, was actually the publication of a book called Silent Spring, written by a lady, Rachel Carson, who is right there. That is Rachel Carson, who published Silent Spring in 1962. The Silent Spring, specifically, Rachel Carson was very concerned over the effect of pesticides on birds. This was in the days where what we now know were quite toxic pesticides were used on, in agriculture, that were sprayed over, areas. And I think the one that was in question here was actually like a mosquito repellent kind of a thing that, planes and such would drop over large areas. And Rachel Carson had done research and observation and determined that that was very, very damaging to the shells of birds' eggs. And it made it softened them up, and then they couldn't do what they were supposed to do, and the birds wouldn't hatch, thus the name Silent Spring. Her concern that if something wasn't done about this, and if these toxic chemicals were continued to be used, that would eventually cause birds to not be able to reproduce. There wouldn't be any birds, and we wouldn't have any birds singing in the springtime, thus Silent Spring. So this encouraged an action. It sort of, inspired people to, or made people realize the damaging effect that this was happening, and, the kind of negative effects this could continue to have. So that really inspires and encourages a lot of action. You also see the very first Earth Day in 1970, which further was meant and is still around to raise awareness, to encourage action, to get people on board, to get people inspired to do things to protect the environment, to be part of a solution to environmental health. All of this, eventually, one of the big things that we have under the Nixon administration, getting to the role of the federal government here, is the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, or as it's often commonly called by its abbreviation, the EPA, in 1970. This is a government agency. It's a part of the federal government. That's job it is to administer environmental protection laws, to raise awareness, to provide education. And what it really does is it sort of takes all these different, both some of the previously passed environmental laws and additional ones that would be passed, and kind of consolidates it all into one area. So instead of those laws being administered and executed by this department or that department, it was kind of all over the place. This was consolidating that and putting it all under one umbrella so that it's more organized and can be more efficiently, or hopefully be more efficiently, executed. So it is the Environmental Protection Agency that is charged with not only education and those sorts of things, but making sure things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all those sorts of things are being enforced, and just putting in those mechanisms and those procedures to make sure that that is done. There are also more environmental protection laws that are passed in the 1970s. Those do continue, stronger regulations about air pollution, about water pollution. I mentioned just offhandedly a second ago the Endangered Species Act, which puts animals that are endangered on, a protected list so that, their environments are protected, those kinds of things. And all of these laws did make some progress in cleaning up waterways and improving air quality, and in some cases helping some animal populations or endangered plants and animals rehabilitate their populations to an extent. Now, another thing we want to look at with domestic issues during the Nixon administration, and really throughout the 1970s, not just under Nixon, is continued activism. So, of course, once the 1960s is over, it's not as if activism, both African American civil rights activism, women's rights, all these different things, it does not just suddenly end. So we mentioned previously how the African American civil rights movement inspires multiple other civil rights movements as well, including Hispanic Americans, Native Americans. We'll eventually see Americans with disabilities, but of course also women. The activism of the African American civil rights movement causes more and more women to further question their position, their lack of rights, and to push for greater change. But just like the African American civil rights movement, the women's rights movement also eventually starts to splinter. It eventually starts to have differences of opinion and very, very strong leadership on both sides here that have very different opinions about exactly what the goals of the women's movement ought to be, what kind of things they ought to be focusing on, and how they ought to be focusing on it. And so that's the part that we really want to look at here, is this splintering of the women's movement as we move into the 1970s. One big thing that was mentioned in the previous chapter was the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, that was proposed and passed by Congress. This would have been a constitutional amendment that would have banned any kind of gender discrimination, but that passed Congress but has never been officially ratified. It has been defeated, or was defeated then. It's still occasionally you'll hear some groups bring it up, but it has yet to be enacted as an amendment. And what's interesting is that a lot of the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment came from female activists. It came from women that would have identified themselves as pro-women's rights, that would have identified themselves as feminists. But what we're getting here is a division of exactly what feminism means and different types of feminism. And that's what we'll kind of look at, that defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment sort of in that context. So what we're seeing in the women's movement is the split between what might be identified as liberal feminism versus radical feminism. And it is those liberal feminists that oppose things like Equal Rights Amendment. So liberal feminism, they wanted women's rights. Yes, they were all in favor of women's rights and those kind of things, and women having equal opportunities. But liberal feminism was more about practical, political, and legal reform, making sure women had the same rights as men, the right to get an education, the right to certainly vote, the right to make their own financial decisions, the right to, have the same exact legal, civil, and political rights as men, using political reforms, legal reforms, that women had the same opportunities. So they would say that women, shouldn't be denied entrance to a college. Women should not be denied a credit card, those sorts of things. So they supported those kinds of reforms. What we were looking at in the 1960s probably more fits that whole description of wanting women to have equal rights and equal opportunities, so forth and so on. But we start to see this splintering of a more radical, bit more extreme. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because about whether or not this is good or bad is completely subjective. And also some of the things that were identified as radical in the 1970s, I dare say, whether you agree with them or not, I dare say they're a bit more accepted now in 2023, 50 plus years later. So just keep that in mind, that can be a little bit tricky and perhaps a little bit uncomfortable. So just sort of take that for what it is. But radical feminism, or at least what was labeled as radical in the 1970s and 80s, was a much more extreme reordering, or the desire for a much more extreme reordering of gender roles altogether. They wanted any and all male supremacy eliminated. They want everything that liberal feminists want, but they want to take it further. It's almost as if they are more about cultural change, or just as much about cultural change as they are about the legal things. Of course, women shouldn't be barred from attending college, certain jobs, these sorts of things. But they are also, in some of the more extreme ones, objecting to any kind of distinction whatsoever from one gender to the other. They are trying to bring more attention to things like sexual objectification of women in the workplace, in movies, and cultural awareness of rape and violence against women, rape culture, those sorts of things. Again, stuff that you hear a lot more about now. That's become far more mainstream, I think, and become more sort of palatable for people to talk about. But in the 1970s, that was far more radical. So their issue was, it's not so much the law that's the problem, that we do need to work on that and continue with that, but it's also just about cultural gender relations. And see, that's where the liberal feminists disagreed with them. Liberal feminists, and the reason why liberal feminists end up being kind of the leaders in blocking things like the Equal Rights Amendment, because liberal feminists might argue that yes, women should have equal opportunities, but women still have certain roles that women should perform, like being mothers, for example. And they worried that things like the Equal Rights Amendment would undermine those traditional values and undermine women's role in the home and undermine the family, and be just sort of a breakdown of society if women did not perform those roles that they were meant to. Again, they didn't say that meant women couldn't be a lawyer if they wanted to, but there were certain roles that women were bound to perform, or should anyway. So that's where that movement is splintering. And that's, again, that the anti-feminism, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. The anti-feminism is that crowd that felt that either one of these, particularly radical feminism, was undermining family values, was undermining tradition, and that was dangerous. That would mean the breakdown of families, that would mean, a lack of morality. That, it kind of goes back to that whole women being the moral center of the family, which is a very, 19th century at least idea. The anti-feminist crowd worried about that. They worried about things like the Equal Rights Amendment, meaning, would that mean that women would have to sign up for the draft? Would that mean that women would not be entitled to things like alimony and child support and those kind of things? And those are legitimate questions that have yet to be answered, because the ERA amendment has never gone through to ratification. But we start to see that that backlash against some of those things. And we'll continue to see that anti-feminism movement growing. And calling it anti-feminism sounds like really negative. It doesn't mean, don't confuse that with like women should, not speak in public and shouldn't be allowed to vote. It's not that, but more arguing that women do have a specific role that ought to be recognized, that there is a difference between men and women, that would certainly object to radical feminism at all. And they may also be opposed to birth control, abortion, some of those kind of things, and saw that as women kind of getting out of their place in a way that might be devastating to the country in some sort of a way. And we'll continue to see that, particularly as we see the rise of conservatism. That anti-feminism movement is a very, very important part of that conservative movement that is that's definitely building, and we're really going to see that come really full froth by 1980. So let's take a look at Nixon's politics. Nixon, we have talked about a couple of times. We mostly looked at him in the 1950s and early 60s as a crusader of anti-communism, really built his career on that anti-communism crusade. Nixon is quite an interesting and complicated person. He's, very smart. He's very cunning, very determined to succeed. Also very introverted, not really comfortable with a whole lot of people. It's kind of one of those situations. It's sort of odd that he chose politics as his profession. Politics is a field where you really have to build relationships and schmooze with people and all that, build relationships, and that's something that Nixon very much struggled with. He had a handful of people he was close to, and everybody else he just sort of tolerates. He can be very suspicious, kind of a person, very paranoid kind of person, which explains some, missteps, big missteps he will eventually take. We'll talk about that soon. Has quite the inferiority complex. Takes things personally. So while he's incredibly smart and talented in a lot of ways, he also can be very paranoid, and that is ultimately what will undo his entire presidency and his entire legacy, unfortunately. But we'll get to that part later. Looking at his political strategy, for Nixon, we talked about his election. He runs on, the whole law and order thing, the silent majority. There's also a campaign strategy he essentially was utilizing called the Southern strategy, which basically means getting support of the South, which, keep in mind, once again, the South had been pretty solidly Democrat since the Civil War. Republicans really didn't have a shot there. We've talked a little bit how that has been changing since Eisenhower, a little bit more with Goldwater, and significantly more with Nixon. So Nixon realized with his appeal to the silent majority, to the working class, that he could win, and did win, by getting support from working class, middle class, white Americans, a lot of them in the South. And this is a big reason for Nixon's success, is his use of the Southern strategy. Nixon realized the South has always been more conservative. Republicans were more conservative. The South has always been very patriotic, very anti-communist, very, very religious, skeptical of a lot of social welfare programs, which the Democrats had taken on in the New Deal, and then even more so in the Great Society. So he's recognizing those changes that are taking place, that the South is becoming less solidly Democratic, and a lot of their majority values are really coming more in line with the Republican Party by this point. The South has also by this point experienced significant population growth. We've talked about the growth of the South in population after World War II, with making them far more politically relevant. So not only are there more potential votes in the South, but there's both in both a political sense, there's more people that might support the Republicans, but there's also literally more people there. So he is very much wooing the South and getting a lot of their support, and we're seeing the South move much more towards the Republican Party. And again, we will see that very much by the 1980s. So the South is really leading this backlash against 60s radicalism, 60s liberalism. They're also opposed to higher taxes to pay for social welfare programs, and in many cases opposed to a lot of strong civil rights activism. So Nixon is very much utilizing that, and that's very much part of his whole political plan and how he gets to the White House, is by getting the South, which is a bit unusual at this point for a Republican, but it's about not to be unusual. As far as so Nixon seizes that opportunity. As far as his domestic program, Nixon, of course, being a Republican, not wanting to initiate whole new federal programs, although we do see some of that with the environmental stuff. But his domestic agenda can be summed up into what's called new federalism. If you remember from way back when, federalism is the division of power between national government or federal government and the states. So it is those, that separation of federal responsibilities and state responsibilities. What new federalism was really all about was about passing on a lot of authority back to the state. So not dismantling social welfare programs, not dismantling Medicare and Medicaid, not getting rid of food stamps, keeping all of those things, but putting a lot of that decision making about how that money gets spent to the state. So it's passing a lot of that on to the states, giving the states more authority there. So a lot of people don't realize that a lot of things like Medicaid, those things, yes, it's a federal program, but what the federal government does is they give all that money to states in a big, what's called a block grant. It's up to the state to decide what those qualifications are, exactly who's going to get that. That is all decided state by state. So things, and that's not true of all government programs, but of some of them, like Medicaid, for example, that is a state decision of how they want to spend that money. If they want to expand or not expand Medicaid benefits, they don't have to do what the federal government suggests. So Nixon's point there was to put more of that on the states and less power to the federal government. So it's not getting rid of and dismantling those programs, but giving more state power, more state control over it. Now, the big economic story of the 1970s has to do with this is where the stalemated thing comes in, the lack of economic growth, and what really seemed like a lot of economic distress throughout the 1970s. So we have seen this huge, economic expansion at the end of World War II, the longest economic expansion in the United States' history. That economic expansion ends in the 1970s. So unfortunately, that is something that Nixon has to deal with. This word here, malaise, malaise means, just like if you're, it describes like if someone is, like if you're sick and you just feel just really run down, you don't want to do anything, don't want to move, don't want to go anywhere, just feeling really, really run down, that's malaise. So that's where the economy was in the 1970s, just kind of run down, not really wanting to move anywhere, not wanting to go anywhere. And the name for that describes the economy of the 1970s is what's called stagflation. So stagflation, what is happening here is the economy is actually in recession, which means the economy is shrinking. We've been in economic growth all throughout the 1950s and 60s. In the 1970s, we start to hit a recession. The economy is starting to retract. And that's happening for a couple of reasons. One is spending. A lot of government spending that just couldn't keep up. So you had all these great society programs. And of course, the big one, Vietnam, that the Vietnam conflict was really racking up the bills. And so you had way too much spending going on without tax increases to fund it. And so that eventually leads to economic recession. So a huge deficit, unemployment, all those kind of things. Also, by the 1970s, the United States no longer has the kind of post-World War II economic dominance that it once had. You're talking 2 decades later. Europe has recovered. The Asian economy is picking up. So the United States faces a whole lot more competition in the world economically than it did 20 years before. So that also slows some things down. So what we're seeing here is recession, which means that's what GDP is over there, or that's not what GDP is, but that stands for gross domestic product. That's one of the many things that we use to measure the health of the economy, and it was shrinking, it was going down, higher unemployment, just a retraction of the economy overall. But what was also happening was high inflation. And I think certainly in this current context, we all know what inflation is, and we all know what that feels like, of having prices continue to go up. What's weird about that is typically when there is a recession, typically the economy is shrinking. Usually we see deflation as prices tend to go down. It's when the economy is growing that we worry about inflation, that we worry about it growing too fast and the prices keep going up and up and up. Usually those two things go together. Typically recession and inflation don't go together. But that's what stagflation is referring to. Stag is in stagnant. The economy was stagnant. It was not moving. It was receding. And then inflation refers to the inflation. And this is an unusual combination that had really never happened before. And economists didn't and still really don't know how to explain this. And what's interesting is I've heard this word come up a little bit recently. And some economists have not gone quite as far to explain or to label our current economic situation as stagflation, but it's pretty close because we're experiencing very, very high inflation. We are not in a recession, though. Our economy is not growing super fast. So it's not quite stagflation, but I think we can relate a little bit, perhaps, to what's going on here, is that inflation is going up way higher, much higher and much faster than people's wages can keep up with. So this means that prices are going up, but people are losing jobs, they're cutting wages, and so people's wages and income cannot keep up with growing prices. This is all exacerbated and made even worse with another thing that compounds this whole problem, the oil crisis of the 1970s. Recall that the United States had been very, very dependent and become more and more dependent on oil as car culture continued to grow, and certainly by the 1970s, incredibly dependent dependent on oil. And so that's one of the many reasons why this oil crisis is going to be so crippling and so devastating and so difficult for a lot of Americans to cope with. The oil crisis stems from the OPEC embargo. If you recall, OPEC, that stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It is basically a cartel. It is an organization of mostly Arab nations. There's also Venezuela in there, but Arab nations like Iraq and Saudi Arabia that produce the majority of the world's oil, and they basically act like a monopoly and control the price of oil. That's where most of the oil the United States gets comes from. In 1973, OPEC, again, mostly Arab nations, was mad at the United States because of our support of Israel in conflicts in the Middle East. So in retaliation for that, in retaliation of the United States supports for Israel, OPEC placed an embargo on oil to the United States. So you can imagine what that did. So that means that the United States was limited to oil that came from non-OPEC countries or that came from the United States, which is not very much. So this caused huge oil shortages. It increased the price of gas, and the oil prices went up by like 400%. I can give you some numbers here. You will not be impressed by these numbers. You will say, if only, but let me give you some perspective in a second. So gas prices went up in the 1970s from a whopping, wait for it, 25 cents a gallon to 65 cents a gallon. But I know you're thinking 65 cents a gallon, I would be in heaven if that was the price of gas. I'm with you. But keep in mind, from 25 cents to 65 cents, that's more than doubling within, a very, very short amount of time. So imagine today if that happened, if gas prices are $3 a gallon. If it went up to $6 a gallon in the next couple of months, I think we'd all be hurting. I think we'd all be trying to carpool and find other ways to get places, because that's a big, big, big increase. But furthermore, not just the prices, but a huge shortage. So we end up with, let me go back, a huge shortage of gasoline. You can see the pictures here. This gas station employee or manager having to tell people we're out. The right here behind my head, you can see these huge lines because there were massive shortages and people running in trying to get their gas, going in early on a Saturday morning. Perhaps your parents are probably too young to remember, but I bet your grandparents do. If you could ask them, grandparents or some aunts and uncles from that time will remember waiting in line, going early on a Saturday morning, trying to fill up, and maybe not being able to get any gas. So that, very much enhances these economic troubles and just economic pains the United States was really feeling in the 1970s. As far as Nixon's response to these, remember, being a Republican, he not of the school of thought that the government needed to engage in a whole lot of action to try to fix this. But nevertheless, he did try a couple of things. And overall, I'll just go ahead and say that any attempt that the Nixon administration made to try to fix the economic problems and economic woes of the 1970s were largely ineffective. And they were also quite erratic. There was not like a streamlined plan of we're going to do this. It was more, we'll try this for a second, and then we'll try that for a second. And nothing really ever worked. He does do some things like raising taxes, reduces spending. Then he tries raising interest rates. None of those things really, really worked. It really just kind of fed into the recession. One of the things that also Nixon did was utilize price freezes. Price freezes is when the government basically says this price of whatever good they order a price freeze on has to stay right here. Say it's got to stay in this spot to prevent inflation. To say if the price of bread is $1, it's got to stay at $1. It can't go up. The thing about price freezes is as all economic decisions do, they cause a lot of bad side effects as well. And these ultimately did not work, and partially because they put price freezes on some things, but not all things. And so it just wasn't effective, and it just really caused a lot more problems, depending on who you were and what you did. But overall, these price freezes, wage freezes, none of it really worked. And so most of those expired after about 90 days without really bringing about a whole lot of success or an end to these economic problems. So stagflation continues to plague the economy throughout the rest of the 1970s, not just in the Nixon administration. And we will see his successors continue to try to deal with some of those problems, particularly inflation. But we won't really see the United States come out of that economic recession until the 1980s.